Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation and our final look at the Hunger Games movie series. So, let us find out if this saga ended on a high or low note. I give you Mockingjay, Part 2. Released in 2015, Mockingjay Part 2 is the lowest grossing movie in the Hunger Games series. It was still considered a commercial success and made a substantial fiscal profit, but apparently enough people were disappointed by Part 1 to have a sizable impact on its ticket sales. Okay, here's my thoughts on the book just as a book, regardless of the film that I teased you with in the last episode. Oddly enough, there's actually a scene in another film that co-stars Jennifer Lawrence that quite accurately sums up my feelings towards the end of Mockingjay.
What the fuck? Stupid fucking book.
Yeah, I really didn't care for that ending. I hope you were paying attention to the spoiler warning before, because I'm about to cite details. I have two major issues with it. Issue 1 is that, ultimately, due to how things worked out in the end, Katniss stops being, for want of a better description, a good thing about halfway through the book. She makes a minor contribution to saving the survivors of District 2, but from then on she does nothing but plot to get her own way and inadvertently get a lot of good people killed. If Katniss hadn't led the Star Squad off on her fake mission, it's likely that Finnick and the others who died horribly would have seen the war's conclusion, and it's entirely possible that Coin wouldn't have arranged for Prim's death if Katniss had proven she was able to follow her lead. All this is exacerbated to the extreme by the fact that her self-appointed mission was a total failure. After everything, she doesn't even see President Snow, and her journey ends with her lying in a smouldering heap in the capital streets. I may just be set in somewhat childish ways, but I have an unwavering belief that the hero of a story should be someone who saves the day in some manner. In this story, Katniss is, at best, just an observer of the people who actually made a difference, namely the rebel soldiers who fought and sacrificed their way into the capital step by bloody step, and at worst she's a foolish, arrogant girl who led good people to their doom based on a juvenile, selfish belief that she was the person in the whole country who had been wronged the most by President Snow, and she had the right to assassinate him. I declare bullshit. Issue number 2 concerns the depressing note the book ends on, which I'll come back to in the adaptation review. This complaint, I have to admit, has less weight to it, as it essentially boils down to my personal preference for happy endings. I'd gotten invested in the well-being of these characters and wanted to see them taken care of in the conclusion. The thing is, though, I really can't be mad at Suzanne Collins for this. As much as people like me desire one, authors do not owe us a happy ending. If she wants a realistic, depressing finale to her series, that is 100% her prerogative, and to do otherwise would have been a betrayal of artistic integrity. My issue is simply this: depressing endings make me feel depressed. And I don't like feeling depressed. I like feeling happy, and, situation appropriate, slightly aroused. The last page of the book left me feeling so empty inside I actually yelled, "Oh, come on!" out loud. And do you know what the absolute worst part of it all was? At the time, I was in the waiting room of the local vets. Do you have any idea what it's like to receive an accusatory stare from 17 startled puppies? Let's move on to my thoughts on the film as a film, shall we? As I mentioned at length in the preceding episode, I really don't like that they did this film as a two-parter. It wasn't a long enough book to need it, and the whole thing reeked of the studio, Lionsgate, simply trying to squeeze as much money out of the Hunger Games cash cow as possible. Putting that aside as much as possible, I'm happy enough with this film as a film. The visuals they got for the Pan Am countryside, the war-torn districts, and the high-tech capital city were both pleasing, and despite the latter two being predominantly computer-generated, nicely realistic looking. It also continued this series tradition of having some satisfyingly exciting action scenes. I'm obviously omitting the first film from that compliment, because fuck you, shaky cam. I've also no complaints about the performances of most of the cast, even the supporting ones in relatively minor roles, and the soundtrack, something I've not touched upon very much until now, is also pretty damn good as well. Overall, I'd say this is probably my favourite Hunger Games film, although there's a slight default element to it, as I suspect the award would have gone to the first one if the directing hadn't been quite so appalling. Okay, let's compare these mother lovers. I'm actually really looking forward to going back to watching movies that are different enough from the book that I don't have to describe the entire fucking plot. Okay, here we go. Recovering from Peter's deranged assault, Katniss is further distressed to see that the person she once knew may be gone forever, replaced by a feral man creature created by the Capitol. In an attempt to both physically and mentally distance herself from this harsh reality, she volunteers her frontline duty helping to conquer the last district that has remained loyal to the Capitol, number 2. Once there, Brienne of Tarth explains there's a peacekeeper base built deep into a mountain that's surrounded by even bigger mountains that they still have to conquer. Eventually it's agreed that the best way to proceed is simply to collapse part of the mountain, burying all the exits but one and staking that out to to either take prisoners or kill off the counterattack. When survivors start pouring out, things go pear-shaped fast, so Katniss tries to calm everyone the fuck down, getting a gun shoved in her face for her trouble. She makes one of her classic inspiring speeches to talk the guy down, but unfortunately one of his compatriots isn't as impressed. Luckily for Katniss, it appears that Cinna's talent as a clothing designer included a strong practical element, and her Mockingjay costume is bulletproof. She meets Joanna, her half-hearted ally from the Quarter Quell, recently liberated from the capital with Peter while recovering in hospital. She helps herself to her drugs as they recently cut off her supply, and she's developed quite a taste for them. They bond over how much they really don't like each other very much. Later, they attend Finnick's wedding, the last happy distraction 13 has before starting its assault on the capital itself. Skipping ahead slightly, don't worry, it's noted for later, Katniss, Finnick and Gale are assigned to a special elite squad under the command of Boggs, made up of the most skilled and successful soldiers in the army. Despite this abundance of talent, they find out they're only intended to be used as actors for Katniss's old film crew to make more propaganda promos for the districts, much to everyone's outrage and disgust. While doing this, they receive a surprise addition to their squad in the form of a still seriously messed up Peter. Boggs theorizes that Coin has started to see Katniss as a threat to her power base after the war and is hoping Peter will snap and turn her into a martyr. He and the rest of the squad aren't as keen on this idea, so they keep Peter in restraints and try to help him sort reality from the conditioning he received from Snow's torturers. Later, the squad is undertaking a routine mission in a deserted part of the city, and Boggs is killed by a landmine. In his dying moments, he gives Katniss his holographic map of the city and tells her she should go forward with her secret plan of running off and assassinating President Snow. Seconds later, a larger and more ominous trap is sprung, a terrifying black liquid that tries to consume them. This pushes Peter over the edge and he finally snaps and tries to kill Katniss. One of her squad mates successfully saves her, but Peter kills him as a result. Barely escaping from the vile liquid, Katniss sees an opportunity and convinces the others she's on a secret mission to end the war by killing off Snow. They seem skeptical at first, but decide to take her word for it when some of the others chime in to back up her lie. Peacekeepers show up just after they depart and blow up the building they were formerly in, declaring Katniss's death on TV a short time later. Peter is overcome with guilt over his attempt on Katniss and the guy he killed and demands they kill him then and there so he won't be a threat to them anymore. Katniss refuses, so he reluctantly agrees to stick with them. Knowing that the city is absolutely filled with deadly traps referred to as pods, they follow Pollux's idea to go underground through the tunnel network he had to work in for years as a capital slave. This goes well for a little while, but then President Snow finds out that they're alive and where they are, so he floods the tunnel with genetically spliced monsters that resemble a cross between a lizard, a man, and the most shit-in-pajamas-inducing nightmare you've ever had. Almost everyone is violently torn apart trying to escape these monsters, including, tragically, handsome Finnick Odair. Katniss is forced to blow him up with them to end his suffering. They make it back to the surface, only for yet more of them to be killed by traps and attacking peacekeepers. With only a handful of them left, they take shelter with a member of Plutarch's underground resistance, a woman named Tigress, who was a stylist in the Hunger Games until she had herself surgically altered to fit her namesake so much that Snow decided she was too ugly and personally had her kicked out. Overcome with guilt for all the deaths, Katniss admits she made up the mission to kill Snow, only to discover that everyone already knew that and had chosen to go anyway. The general consensus is she should still make the attempt. Peter, worried that he might snap again, can't go, and the other survivors are part of the film crew, not soldiers, so the next day, just she and Gale try to sneak into the presidential estate with the capital refugees fleeing the invading rebels. Coincidentally, the rebels make their final push at this exact moment and all hell breaks loose. Gale is captured by the peacekeepers, but Katniss makes it all the way to the gates of the palace. This is the point in both the book and the film where everything goes wrong for everyone forever. A hovercraft bearing capital markings drops what seems to be aid packages on parachutes, but they turn out to be bombs. Both the rebels and the peacekeepers stop fighting each other to try to help the injured civilian children. Katniss has just enough time to see that her beloved sister Primrose is also there as a medic before the secondary bombs go off, killing her and setting Katniss on fire. Her recovery is a slow and arduous process, hampered by her complete disinterest in continuing living due to the crushing loss of her little sister. The high-tech doctors could replace her burned away skin, but could do very little to mend her shattered mind. After she's physically healed, she's given a room to stay in the presidential palace, and during a random walk there, she finds President Snow himself is being held in a green room full of roses. He tells her that the hovercraft that dropped the bombs was actually sent by President Coin in an attempt to end the fighting early by turning the remaining peacekeepers against him. At first disbelieving, the logic of this claim eventually takes hold of Katniss. The darkness inside Coin is further revealed when she gathers the surviving former victors of the Hunger Games and proposes a plan to have one last game using the children of the capital's ruling class to sate the bloodlust of the districts. They vote on it, and Katniss pretends to be in favour of the idea. A confused Hamish decides to put his trust in her and follows her lead, swinging the yes votes to victory and convincing Coin that Katniss is now firmly in her camp. Katniss is given the honour of being Snow's executioner, but in a shocking turn of events chooses to kill President Coin instead before attempting suicide. Peter apparently saw this coming though and stops her. She's taken to jail for a little bit, but eventually, due to several factors, she's let off the hook pretty much scot-free for this presidential assassination and sent back to what's left of District 12. She doesn't adjust very well to being back, as she's pretty much all alone now due to Gale, her mother, and most of the other 12 survivors not being able to bear going back there. She ends up taking her anger out on Buttercup the cat, who somehow made it back all the way from 13 to 12, though eventually they do make up. For the 100th time, her semi-salvation comes in the form of Peter, who comes back to District 12 to look after her. Finally free of the love triangle with no Gale around, she lets herself fall in love with him. Maybe. I don't know. She's so damaged by this point it's hard to tell. There might be some freaky codependent thing starting here. Both the novel and the film end by skipping ahead a few years to when she and Peter are married and have 2 cheerful children who live oblivious to the hardships their parents had to overcome. Phew! And on top of all that, there's a bunch of nice details the film took straight from the book. Peter's game of real or not real designed to help him sort out his real life from his indoctrination. In this film, Katniss's interactions with President Snow are pretty much spot on. The heart-to-heart that Katniss overhears Gale and Peter having, you can't really tell in the film, but she's actually really offended when they agree that she'll just pick whichever one of them she can't survive without the most. When backed into a corner, President Snow chose to stop relying on his military and fall back on something he knew better, the Hunger Games, employing his game masters to turn the capital into a trap-filled nightmare in the hopes that the invading rebels would lose heart before they could penetrate the inner defenses. I'm pretty happy with their portrayal of the conclusion of Gale's story arc. Part 2 successfully recreated his final descent into the ends justify the means mentality, showing that it was his idea to bury the mountain fortress with everyone inside it. Despite it taking place in a hovercraft instead of the R&D labs of 13, the part where Gale uses his knowledge of hunting snares and traps to help Beetee design some new weapons to use against the enemy, including the type of 2-stage explosion bomb that ended up killing Prim, is a key similarity to the book. Ultimately, it's this philosophy that ends up costing him Katniss. At the end of the book and the film, she can't bear to be around him ever again because there's a chance that he is, in a small way, partially responsible for Prim's death. Right, I rather suspect you know the routine by now. There's way more I could talk about in this section, but let's move on anyway. For, hopefully, the final time, I must repeat myself by saying that the scenes that Katniss was not directly a part of were not technically accurate to the book, as it's told exclusively from her relatively small perspective. For the most part, though, they also held true to the other thing I keep repeating, namely that they only do this to show you things that probably did happen in the book, even if Katniss didn't witness them. That said, I did feel the bit where Snow Darth Vader's his Minister for War for failing to stop the rebels was a little bit too movie villain cliche for my liking. Plus, I couldn't help but notice they did this before everyone had started eating, so good lord, that must have been an awkward meal. Could you pass the salt? Yes, of course. Prim's visit to Peter in the hospital was originally the act of another survivor from District 12, a girl even more neutral in Peter's memory. She hangs around with Katniss in a few other scenes, but doesn't really play any part in the story besides that. It's not hard to see why they chose to stick with someone we already knew in the film. When Peter joins the Star Squad in the book, he seems much more physically recovered than he does in the film. His self-confidence and a good amount of his charisma has returned. He's still openly cold towards Katniss, so everyone knows he's still under the control of the Capitol's conditioning, but he's nothing like the lost little lamb he appears as at first in the film. The film belatedly worked in the I get to kill Snow line in a new context of seeming to be leverage for Katniss' support for the final Hunger Games. The death of the League sisters has changed a bit. One of the twins died much earlier, killed by a trap, and was the reason the squad had an opening for Peter to fill, and the other died later during the infiltration of the Capitol. The film tweaked it a bit so they died together fighting the Peacekeepers. A relatively minor point, but something I noticed, the film changed it so the cute child in the Capitol doesn't get mowed down by stray machine gun fire seconds after Katniss sees her mourning her mother. I mean, I wasn't hoping to see this, I'm just saying. President Snow is, as usual, the most embellished character, being the center point of many film-only scenes, though I like that they use this to establish things like his failing health. The exact nature of his death is a little unclear in the book, it being possible that he finally choked on his mouth blood because he laughed too hard, or his health just finally gave out, or he was trampled to death by the mob trying to get to Coin or Katniss. In the film, it looks more like the mob has started beating him to death, but my personal suspicion was that that was what had actually happened in the book and they were just covering it up to avoid the scandal, so I'm actually quite pleased with that. While President Coin showing her true colors is one of the final plot points in the book, it's noticeably less subtle in the film. The book President Coin probably wouldn't have been foolish enough to tell Katniss she was planning to be in charge for an indefinite amount of time, or take President Snow's exact position on the podium, because this woman was not unfamiliar with the concept of symbolism. Of course, once again, the absence of the book's internal monologue is probably a big factor here, so without these more obvious hints, it might have been hard to fully get across what a bitch she really was in the film and risk villainizing Katniss for killing her. I'd like to briefly mention once again the very sad death of Philip Seymour Hoffman that occurred towards the end of this film's production, as I think I've pinned pinpointed one of the scenes he was intended to be in, namely where he fills Katniss in on the events she missed immediately after her assassination of Coin, which is now being performed by Hamish. Hamish reads a letter from Plutarch covering some plot points I assume were intended for him to deliver personally originally. Interestingly, in regards to this comparison, the character's absence here is overshadowed by the fact that these plot points in of themselves represent a much bigger change to the story, as they reveal that Plutarch had manipulated the situation for Katniss to be given a chance to kill Coin in the hopes that she would do so. In the book, while he admittedly showed zero sadness that she was dead, there's no indication that he wanted her gone. I've discovered in my year or so doing Lost in Adaptation that my favourite type of change to talk about is the ironic change. Mockingjay Part 2 provides such a change with gusto. After what's left of District 2 switches to the rebels' side, President Coin tells Katniss they don't really need her for the war effort anymore, and while her fancy armour and cool bow look great on camera, the urban warfare of the assault on the capital is no place for an untrained and undisciplined civilian. In both versions, Katniss is obviously perturbed by this as she wants to see the war to its finish and get personal revenge on President Snow. However, her solution is radically different between the book and the film. In the book, she realizes she has to finally bunker down and commit to being a team player. She and Joanna start going to all the mandatory fitness and military training sessions she'd been ignoring until now. They make good progress, and as a result, the District 13 military command decide to let them take the final test to become soldiers. These exams are custom designed to test what 13 believes to be a person's greatest weakness. In the case of Katniss, it was the inability to take orders she didn't agree with and trust in her commanding officers. At the last minute, she recognizes this fault in herself and passes the test. In the film, they change it so she just goes right on ignoring orders and not trusting in her commanding officers and smuggles herself to the capital in a hovercraft. Once she's there, Coin and Plutarch decide to just go with it so people won't know that they can't control her. It's the exact opposite of what happened in the book. Now, I realize whatever character development Katniss originally took from this was completely wiped away later when Coin sent Peter to join her squad and she realized she really shouldn't be trusting her superiors, but it remains an ironic change regardless. Incidentally, this also represents a large change for Joanna, as in the film she shows no real interest in going to fight in the capital herself, while in the book she was devastated that she failed her final test and was denied the right to do so. Okay, on to what seems at first to be a small, but I consider the single biggest change of the whole Hunger Games series. If you cast your mind back a few minutes, you'll remember that I had quite a bit to say on the subject of books with sad, or at least bittersweet endings. If you only saw the film, you might have been a little confused by this, as its ending might have had you thinking Katniss was reasonably happy in her sunny field with her family. This scene in the book, if you were to just describe it visually, would be indistinguishable. However, due to the lack of internal monologue and the choices the filmmakers went with in regards to tone make them radically different. Allow me to explain. I am aware that this is somewhat open to interpretation, but my personal understanding of the book's end was that Katniss never really recovers. All the trauma of the games, the war, the sacrifices, and the loss of Prim in particular was just too much for her. She spends the rest of her life in a sort of detached melancholy, and the game she describes where she lists all the acts of kindness and good she's ever seen performed is barely sufficient to keep her sane. She feels the usual expected parental joy at beholding her children, but she admits she didn't really want them in the first place and only went along with it because Peter was so keen. Every day that she sees them in 12, she can't shake the knowledge that their playground is a graveyard. Book Katniss finishes her tale as one of those war veterans who take comfort in the knowledge that they served a greater good and made the world a better place, but on a personal level can't unsee the things they've witnessed and can never really fully function as a normal human being ever again. Using little more than the tiniest of smiles, the film flipped all of that on its head in my opinion. Katniss's look of contentment and the calming music combined to give the impression she's finally put all of that behind her and is ready to live happily ever after with her family. Now, at this point you might be wondering, well then the Dom, you gorgeous example of sexy manhood, seeing as the book's ending depressed you so much, does that mean you like the ending of the film better? To which my obvious response is, I don't know! I did indeed hate the book's ending, but I also respected it. It's a powerful way to end the series and I gave Suzanne big props for it. The film's ending, which I would have loved to see in the book, now seems like a total cop-out. Ugh, brain pain! You broke me with that little smile, Jennifer Lawrence. I hope you're happy. What's weird is, despite two films being made for one book, the story still gets condensed somewhat. It's not a massive deal, but you really don't get the same sense of time passing in the film as you do in the book because of them skipping over various everyday life activities in District 13 and the long recovery time after all her multiple injuries. They had her leaving for District 2 pretty much straight away after Peter shows himself to be completely doolally. Then again later when she leaves for the capital, it happens much quicker than in the book, so they end up leaving out things like them awkwardly meeting in the canteen while he was still in hating her mode. The film skipped over the only time Boggs ever loses his shit. He managed to maintain his composure through getting his nose broken by Gale, intense combat, and even, to a certain extent, his own violent death. But when Peter is delivered to his squad and he realizes that Coin is trying to kill Katniss, it's implied heavily that he really goes to bat for her, and it's the only time Katniss ever sees him enraged. I mentioned before that Peter involuntarily whispering along with the mutts in the sewer was accurate. However, I feel I should also mention that they didn't show that Katniss was seconds away from putting an arrow in his brain because she thought that meant he was snapping again. There's one particularly large and nasty trap that the film avoided that the Capitol tried to use to kill Katniss and Gale right outside the presidential mansion. The street itself opens up into a pit full of monsters, killing rebels, peacekeepers, and civilians indiscriminately. It was while escaping this that Katniss and Gale got split up and Gale got captured. The movie also left out the old doctor that treats Katniss as she's recovering from her burns. He's the only one of her many doctors that she likes at all because he doesn't bother trying to console her over the loss of her sister. He's one of the main reasons Katniss isn't punished for killing Coin in the book, because he deemed her mentally disorientated and not responsible for her actions. And finally, the film left out the fucked up dream Katniss has as she's on the point of death after the explosion. It involved flying, burning, drowning, metaphors for Prim, the war, her despair. It would have made for quite a visually interesting segment, but as the rest of it is so decidedly unartsy, I can see why it would be considered a bit too much of a juxtaposition to end the film on. The Dom's final thoughts. I'd have to say that overall this is probably the least loyal of all the Hunger Games films, which makes it a bit ironic that it's my favourite considering my usual predisposition towards book accuracy. I do want to stress that it's still very, very fucking loyal by usual adaptation standards. It's just the others were more so. This one played just a little bit too fast and loose with a few things, so it fell to the back of this particular team. I suspect I might be susceptible to changes of heart down the line, but right now I'm pretty fucking happy with this adaptation. The Dom's final thoughts about the whole Hunger Games thing altogether. These films are unquestionably the most accurate adaptations I've covered on this show so far, smashing even the previous record holders like The Princess Bride and Shawshank Redemption. The fact that they're still a bit hit or miss with the fans of the book despite this has got to be the ultimate example of how being a 100% verbatim recreation is not necessarily the key to being a really good adaptation. As example, I cite once again that the lead character you're dealing with here is incredibly withdrawn and insular to start with, and becomes even more so as these stories go on. She's a young woman of such incredible depth of emotion, but if you just watched the film and never picked up the books, you wouldn't know that. She appears in the film as a person detached and disinterested most of the time, with the occasional out-of-character reaction to certain things. There is, I suspect, no perfect way to adapt a character so well suited to books but so poorly suited to screen, but I really don't think that just keeping her as is like they did here was the way to go. But then again, maybe I'm full of shit. Maybe in an alternative universe right now there's a different The Dom who's bemoaning them changing Katniss to an overacting emotional wreck of a character who vocalizes her every thought and has clown-like over-the-top expressions. Was there a possible middle ground for Katniss Everdeen? I highly doubt we'll ever know. This does not strike me as reboot material at all. You know, it's been quite the emotional journey for me on this one, beautiful watchers. Not only has my opinion been radically reversed on multiple occasions, it's also a little overwhelming to spend so much time analysing the same story and characters like this over multiple episodes. I sure am glad there's nothing much longer, more popular, and way more time-consuming looming on the near horizon. That would just completely push me over the deep end. What are you staring at? Oh, fuck me! Hey beautiful watchers, just giving you the usual reminder that I have a rather nice Patreon page if you fancy having a look at it. Just in case you didn't know, Patreon is a fan sponsorship website that allows you to support the shows you like and earn a variety of related rewards. I am this close to being able to go full time at this and provide way more Lost in Adaptation videos per month, so if you feel like joining up, I'll be especially grateful. Thanks for watching. I don't suppose you'd rather get a cheeky Nando's instead, would you? Fuck yeah, let's blow this joint. So long, Snow, you fucking psycho.